Hi, friends, and welcome to the 1840 podcast, where each month we explore a different topic balancing modern sensibilities with traditional sensitivities to give you new approaches to timeless Jewish ideas. I'm your host, David Beshefkin, and this month we're continuing our exploration of the war in Israel, and we are asking, what's next? This podcast is part of a larger exploration of those big, juicy Jewish ideas, so be sure to check out 1840.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly emails. We've been asking the question, what is next? As the world, and specifically the Jews' place in the world, our place in the world, seems to have been reordered since October 7th. And aside from asking what's next for Jewish communities in Israel, we are asking what is next. For Jews in higher education, there is a long history of Jews being second-class citizens and being marginalized in higher education. And for the past few decades, it seems to have been going really well, actually, until October 7th kind of resurfaced so much of the anger and the outrage that people have been feeling towards Jews in ways that frankly have been jaw-dropping. And we have an absolutely incredible episode where we are speaking with quite literally world-renowned leaders on this subject, people who have spoken before Congress, people who have been quite vocal in really the halls of power about this issue. And I'm so excited and really privileged to be presenting these voices today in one little bit long but very important episode. Our first guest is someone who I feel privileged to call a friend, somebody who I have known, who's writing, and whose approach to issues has really influenced my own in so many ways, and that is Rabbi David Wolpe. He was the rabbi for many years at Sinai Temple, a conservative synagogue in Los Angeles. Rabbi David Wolpe actually teaches at Harvard. He teaches at Harvard Divinity School and was part of the task force coalition at Harvard dealing with anti-Semitism. Of course, he publicly stepped down from that task force, which we discuss why he stepped down and what his general approach to this issue is and what our approach really should be. He recently wrote an op-ed that I think is really important. It was published in the Harvard Crimson, where he lays out for the students how he sees this issue. And he doesn't really hold any punches. I mean, he is quite forthcoming in the seriousness of this issue. The op-ed begins as follows. An anti-Semite is someone who hated me before I was born, Elie Wiesel, survivor of Auschwitz, said. Anti-Semitism is a denial of humanity of the Jew. The reactions that occurred at Harvard in the wake of October 7th considered Jews oppressors and in some ways unworthy of human consideration. I'm going to skip a little bit, and then he really addresses the issue as he understands it at Harvard. He continues, one ideology common at Harvard is the colonialist settler ideology. Colonialists are people who come from one place, take a land, and now have two. But Jews are far from being colonialists. Jews come from Israel. In this ideology, the colonialists are almost always white, but the Jews in Israel are quite diverse. Colonialists do not share the land, but Israel gave the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt and has many separate offers to share their land with Palestinians, which the Palestinians rejected. Further, Jews were kicked out of Israel by one colonial power, Rome, and returned by overthrowing the rule of another, Britain. Much of Harvard is captured by an ideology that centers oppression, but dividing all of the world into oppressor and oppressed is dangerous. Once you divide humanity by race or creed or nation into two camps, the good and the evil, you have adopted the mentality of the despot. This is bad for society as well as for Jews. It is a powerful opening, and it really takes a leader, somebody like Rabbi David Wolpe, to not only write this, but have the standing to have it published in the Harvard Crimson, to speak gently but strongly and honestly about how he sees this issue playing out in higher education. So it is our absolute privilege and pleasure to introduce our conversation with Rabbi David Wolpe. You have been really on the forefront of dealing with anti-Semitism on campus and some of the major issues that have emerged since October 7th, but I want to take you back one day to October 6th. And I want to know, if I would have approached you on October 6th and asked you, is there an issue of anti-Semitism on the college campus you teach in Harvard's Divinity School, what do you think your response would have been?
I'm guessing that I would have said, yes, there is some issue, and students have discussed it. And I actually even heard about it before I came to Harvard, but that I didn't think that it was going to impact my time there or most students' time there. And I think that that actually was more or less true. I remember telling my congregants who said, like, what are you going to do when you get to Harvard? And I said, I'm not there to be an activist. I'm only there for a year. I'm going to read and write, and that's pretty much it. And of course, then it became completely unavoidable.
Yeah, so I have a very real question that I think has implications, even though it's very directed at you and your specific decision. You were on an anti-Semitism advisory committee. I don't know if I'm getting it correctly in Harvard.
Exactly right.
And when some of this broke out, you publicly decided to leave the committee and to say, you know what, this is not working for me. I'm wondering if you can explain in this decision, but even something more broadly speaking on this issue, how do you decide when to work from within and when to work from without? I think it's a question that's actually even much broader than what we're dealing with now. I face this question a lot.
Yeah.
Is it better to work within an imperfect system and at least you have your voice, but you have to, make these compromises and negotiations from within? Or when is it appropriate, or what are the circumstances that had you decide, I need to step away from this and maybe work from without?
First of all, it is actually a fascinating question. And a lot of people said to me, you're making a mistake. You should stay on the committee. And I would say there are essentially three reasons why I thought in this case it's better. And some of them may be applicable to other cases, some not. One is because obviously I didn't think that we were successful in getting done what I really believed we should do. And not because of the other committee members, I want to say, who are fantastic. I had no issue with the members of the committee themselves. I thought they were great and are great. The second is because I felt like I was giving the committee a certain credibility that was increasingly, it was like a diminishing return. People kept saying to me, look, you're on the committee and things are getting worse. Obviously, you're not doing anything, or the committee's not doing anything, or why are you giving cover to this? All of that sort of thing. And then third, if I was leaving Harvard, I think they would have a better case. But I still speak to the people in the committee. I still speak to the administration. I still speak to the students. And I would argue, if anything, my voice has gotten louder rather than softer by not being on the committee. And so in this particular case, if you can actually work outside the thing that you believe in, and you're not just saying, I absolve myself of responsibility, but rather you're shifting it, then it makes sense. If the mechanism that you're working in is effective, it's just going to take a little more time, or it requires work, then I understand why people would want to work from within. But I did not feel like, and I would say the other part of it is, I really thought anything the committee could achieve with me there, they could achieve without me there. They really could. I mean, they're advising the president, and I trusted the other members. They were going to give the same advice, basically, whether I was there or not. So for all those reasons, for me, I don't want to say it was a simple decision, but it was a clear-cut decision.
I fully appreciate that. I have a question in terms of the work. You mentioned, getting the work that needs to be done. What, in your opinion, still needs to be done to make sure that Jews on campus, and really all those on campus, are able to kind of operate with safety, with security, with decency?
Right.
What do you think are the major changes that need to make? And you could talk specifically on the Harvard campus or even more generally.
A good start would be to enforce the laws you already have. I mean, you're not supposed to break into classrooms with protests. You're not supposed to break into the library with protests. And there was a time, by the way, during the 60s, let me just say something positive about the protesters in the 60s. They were willing to take the consequences. It's like, if you're going to do civil disobedience, okay, so you take the consequences of doing civil disobedience. But that's not what's happening now. People are protesting with no consequences, even when it's clear that their protests are not legitimate. In the context of the university itself, I turn people all the time to what I think is one of the best pieces that really you can read on this by Danielle Allen, who's an African-American liberal professor of government at Harvard, very well-respected, brilliant woman, who wrote a piece saying basically that these protests are creating a climate of intimidation. And that if she were sending her kid to a place where people were standing on the library steps screaming white power, she wouldn't send her kid to such a place. And it's basically the same. So I think the university has to figure out how to not let kids intimidate other students. Free speech is fine. You want to say from the river to the sea, as much as I hate it, I think that should be allowed. But if you want to yell it at everybody who has a yarmulke, that shouldn't be allowed. that's one thing. The second is that I really believe there are two kinds of training that should be going on at universities, especially that have this problem. One is they should learn about Jewish history and anti-Semitism, because Jews stand at the foundation stone of Western civilization, and anti-Semitism is endemic. I am at the Divinity School. If they don't teach, and I don't want to speak too generally, but if you're at a divinity school at Harvard and kids don't know how Jews have fared under Christian and Muslim rule for thousands of years, then your education is really deficient in divinity school. And there should be training on how to have civil discourse at campuses, because right now, as you know, free speech on campus is a severely lopsided issue. There are things about which you can speak as freely as you want, but then when you say other things, you can't.
I want to hear a little bit about how you counsel. I'm sure there are many Jews on campus, and this has energized in many ways. Right. There are two things happening at once. There's something where Jews feel less safe, and there's something where there's an upswelling of Jewish pride, and Jews really feel an importance. I have two questions about your relationship to Jewish students themselves. Number one is they have a similar question that you did. Is it better to work from within or from without? Do you feel like now is the time for Jews to divest, so to speak, from the Ivy Leagues and find places where we are more welcome? Should this be a major factor, or is now the time to double down and say we are not going anywhere? I have a second question, but I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on this.
I'm on the one hand, on the other hand camp on this. That is, I think it's really important to support institutions that support Jews, campuses and otherwise, but I don't want to abandon Harvard, Yale, Cornell, Penn, all these places, Stanford, because I think that they're places of tremendous resource where also you can find a lot of support and a lot of people who are pretty strong on Jewish voices. I mean, certainly at Harvard, there's a strong Jewish community, some wonderful students, some terrific faculty members. So I wouldn't want to give up on them. But I think that the default that, oh my God, you have to get into one of these places or you don't count is foolish and counterproductive. And there are a lot of other wonderful schools out there that Jews should start going to and supporting.
One of the questions that comes up is that, there are Jews who are awakening to their Jewish pride because of this fight against anti-Semitism. And there's this reminder that I feel like the point of Judaism is not to fight anti-Semitism. This is not what we want to be spending our time doing. How do you counsel students? What direction do you point them when they feel this awakening of Jewish pride and they feel this awakening of their Jewish identity? And obviously so much of it is being channeled to activism about Israel, and that's also incredibly important. Where do you take that energy? Where do you point them? You're sitting on the Harvard campus, you have this awakening and upswelling. What do you tell students who for the first time in their lives feel this pang and this pull? I am Jewish, what do I do with it?
So I tell them, I think the same thing that you would tell them, which is, first of all, there's Hillel, there's Chabad. There are a lot of choices on campus. I'm starting to teach in the spring a course called Sources of Jewish Spirituality. We're going to be doing Tanakh, Midrash, the medievals. It was really Bachli ibn Pekuda that led me to think about giving this kind of course, Chovot Alavavot, that there are spiritual and emotional aspects to Judaism, internal aspects that we'll study. And I tell them that there's this tremendous, rich tradition. There's a reason why the Jews have not stayed Jews because people hate them. This is a canard that people believe. A lot of people have been hated through history. The reason you don't know about them is because they're gone, which is what it's supposed to do. That's what hating people and killing people is supposed to do, is make them leave. The reason that Jews didn't is because Judaism is so powerful and wonderful, not because hatred is so great. And so depending on where they are on the journey, I try to, involve them more to become Jewish, which is the best. And look, I say all the time, ignorance and assimilation are the biggest risks to Jews in America, not anti-Semitism. We lose many, many, many more people through just fading away. And so that's really the battle. The anti-Semitism battle in some ways is easier, more vivid, more quote unquote popular, but the battle for, neshamas, the battle for souls is really the one that we fight best.
In that actual battle, and I couldn't agree with you more in the way that you're counseling and directing, the Jewish student body at Harvard, but there is a wide percentage of the student body who are very adversarial to Israel right now.
Right.
People who may not have known otherwise, and they're swept up. Right. They may not have any relatives or connection to Palestine, but all of a sudden they're swept up on this train. Right. I'm curious for you. You are probably one of the most visible, obvious Jews on Harvard's campus. You've been very outspoken since this has happened. Have you had any productive interactions in prevailing upon the students of Harvard who are on the other side to kind of help turn and steer that ship, that maybe a lot of the outrage that you are feeling is misplaced or motivated by something more nefarious?
Not yet. I have invited a bunch of students to come and speak to me. So far, I have not had those encounters. I hope I will when I start to teach and I'm there more than I was this semester. And also, I hope that I will reach them through some writing on campus organs that will be more directed towards the students. But I think that you're right. It's really important for people to know, first of all, that what you say at 20 might not be what you believe at 40, but also that a lot of these students, there was this wonderful article in the Wall Street Journal that said which river and which sea. And most of the students had no idea, like the Nile, the Ganges, we don't know.
Mississippi, who knows?
Right, exactly. There's some river. And that's important for us to realize, is that when you're 18 or 19 or 20 years old, you just want to be part of your peer group. And that doesn't really mean that you share the beliefs that the core do, because it's a core of agitation on most of the campuses. So on the one hand, there's a big ideological battle to be fought, and I don't want to diminish that. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that all these people are genuine anti-Semites. They're not. I mean, most of them don't actually harbor negative feelings towards Jews, although some do. So you have to be careful. I always think you first start assuming ignorance before you get to malice, and then you'll see.
Stepping back, your big picture, there are people who are very nervous about the direction of the United States of America. There has been an upswelling of anti-Semitism, which, as you noticed, if I would have asked you on October 6th, this came as a surprise.
Yes.
Of how much and how vocal and how widespread this is. As a country, do you remain optimistic as this being a welcoming country to the Jewish people? And what do you think the Jewish community should be doing? I'm very outspoken. I'm online, as are you. And I'm at the point where I'm sometimes nervous where if my advocacy is only making things worse, that we're not really talking to each other. And I want to stay productive. I want to stay on message. I want to stay positive and joyful, even with all of the horrors and the terrors that are surrounding us. So what would be your marching orders for social media? You and I, we see eye to eye in a lot of these things. We're outspoken, but I'm not an agitator. I never have been. Even my personality online the last couple months, I don't recognize myself. I'm quote tweeting things. What would you say is the next step for how we speak as a community and how we try to steady the ship that we can all feel that sense of optimism and safety?
So first of all, am I optimistic? Yes. I'm optimistic in part because I think that America is not like other countries where there were Frenchmen and Jews and there were Russians and Jews, but there aren't Americans and Jews. We are not the one identified other group that everyone looks at. There are lots and lots of groups in America, which leads to my second point, which is we need to recognize our friends as well as our enemies. We're really good at attacking our enemies back, but we don't always thank our friends. And so I tell people all the time, when someone writes positively about Israel, send them an email, thank them, let them know that you appreciate it, because we shouldn't take friends for granted. And then third, don't make an automatic enemy out of somebody on the opposite side of the political spectrum. It doesn't help if right only congratulates right and left only congratulates left. It doesn't help. We have to learn how to be able to speak to people on both sides and not to make automatically this side or that side to demonize them, to be mentioned, to treat everybody decently. And that seems to me incredibly important. We're so pugilistic, and this is part of the nature of social media. But I also think that it's part of the reason why you and I often write such similar kinds of things, is because neither one of us really is out there to antagonize people who disagree with us. We want to reach some kind of understanding.
I appreciate that a great deal. On a personal level, to talk a little bit about your relationship with Israel, I wonder, when was the first time you visited Israel, and what kind of home did you grow up in regarding the connection to the state of Israel?
So my father was a conservative rabbi, and they went to Israel Israel, I mean, many times before I ever went. The first time I went was before my bar mitzvah. And I remember that it was the first time that my father had gone back to Israel after the 67 war. And I'll never forget. I mean, I think I saw my father cry maybe twice in my life. And the one time was when he went to the wall the first time.
Wow.
That was enough for me. That was it for my life. I will never forget that. And so, I mean, I go to Israel usually around twice a year. I'm actually going shortly. I'm going in about a week and a half. Actually, interestingly, I don't have that much family there, but I have a lot of friends there. And I feel like it is one of the greatest, maybe in some ways as a Jew, the greatest blessing of my life is that I live in that sliver of Jewish history when we have in Israel. And if you don't appreciate that and support it, you have no sense of the sweep of Jewish history. So my parents were active in Soviet Jewry and active in Israel, and they were like wonderful parents to learn about what was important. And I still think that what it was that they believed were important is actually what's important. So I was lucky.
I appreciate that notion of living in a sliver of Jewish history. Really, this moment has awakened me on a personal level to the gifts and the blessings of Jewish history. And I find myself immersed and drawn to Jewish history in ways that I haven't been over the past few months.
I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second just to tell you a story that my father told me that I love to tell. It's very short. In 1948, he was a rabbinical student, and they were all waiting outside Madison Square Garden in a huge long line to rush in when the state was going to be announced. And there was a man standing behind him who had a number on his arm, an old man, obviously a survivor. And they all rushed in, and my father saw him sitting right behind it. And he said, "Oh my God, I can't believe you made it. I was worried that you were going to get trampled or you were going to not be able to get to the front." And my father said, "How is it that you made it to the front?" And the man said, "Because I wasn't running alone."
Wow, because I wasn't running alone.
That's the story of Jewish history. You just have to know that you're not running alone.
That is absolutely beautiful. I cannot thank you enough for your time, especially at a time now where Harvard, your work is in the headlines more than you or anyone ever expected.
Yeah.
And we are so thankful and appreciative to have you really on the front lines.
Well, I'm grateful for you, David, and for all of your work and for your humor and your wisdom both, which are both wonderful.
That is very, very kind of you. Thank you.
Yep.
I always wrap up my interviews with more rapid fire questions. Speaking of the sliver of Jewish history, are there specific books that have awakened you to kind of the blessing of Israel within the larger spectrum of Jewish history? Is there a book that you return to that kind of like inspires you, that you recommend to others to appreciate what is the gift of the state of Israel that we have today within the larger spectrum of Jewish history?
Well, either Heschel's Israel, An Echo of Eternity, or I know that it's old, but the LaPierre book, O Jerusalem, which I read the first time or second time I went to Israel, really, like for me, was an enormously influential book. It really made me appreciate like what it took for us to be able to have what we have.
An absolute classic. My next question, which is always strange for somebody who actually went back to school but to teach and not get a degree, if somebody gave you a great deal of money and allowed you to take a sabbatical, which you're actually on, to go back to school and get your own PhD in any subject of your choice, what do you think the subject and title of your dissertation would be?
Well, I know, actually, because I started it. I just didn't finish it. I started it, but then I started to write books and travel. And also the professors that I was studying with, including Amos Funkenstein of blessed memory, they went up north. But it would be a subject in Jewish theology that I might write about this year. So I don't want to talk about it too much, but it would be theology.
But no spoilers. You're not going to tell us which part.
I'm not going to tell you exactly what it is until at least I make some progress on it.
Okay, we'll have to wait for the book. I've enjoyed your others, particularly your book on David HaMelech. The Yale Jewish Live series is my absolute favorite. My final question, I'm always curious about people's sleep schedules. What time do you go to sleep at night, and what time do you wake up in the morning?
I have always been a morning person. I go to sleep as early as I can. So basically, if I'm not subject to someone else's schedule, I'll go to sleep between 9 and 10 at the latest. And I get up around 5 and I go for a long walk early in the morning before I start everything, whatever I'm doing that day. I love the mornings, and I've always been a morning person, and I'm really no good at night at all.
No, it's believable. You have a morning person demeanor. I, unfortunately, have a night owl demeanor, and you're probably better off for your yours. Rabbi David Wolpe, thank you so much for your friendship on a personal level and for your leadership. We are so grateful to you and for you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, David. A pleasure as always. Always.
Rabbi Wolpe's op-ed in the Harvard Crimson that I began with ends with a question where he asks, if we cannot learn to argue civilly at Harvard, how can we hope for the civility of other places in the world? And that's a question that I think should haunt, obviously, not just the Jewish community, but the entire world. I think when we see anti-Semitism in the way that it has manifested, where you see students who are not galvanized about any of the other issues taking place, all of a sudden feel so strongly and have such intense feelings specifically geared towards Israel, you need to wonder what is motivating this pronounced outrage. Which is why our second guest, who is a student, a PhD student at MIT, is somebody whose voice I think is so important. I was introduced to Talia Khan on the same day that the world was introduced to all of the presidents of major Ivy League schools. There were a handful of students who were also given a moment to speak about what they had experienced on college campuses. And this is what Talia Khan, our next guest, said when she was given the opportunity to speak on that famous congressional day.
Thank you so much, Representative Fox and Representative Stefanik, for inviting me here today. My name is Talia Khan. I am an undergraduate alumna of MIT and a current graduate student at MIT. I am the daughter of a Jewish mother and an Afghan Muslim immigrant father. I am the proud president of the MIT-Israel Alliance, and I am a Jewish student currently immersed in an extremely toxic anti-Semitic atmosphere at MIT. The MIT administration, namely President Sally Kornbluth, has failed to address the crisis of rampant anti-Semitism on campus. There is a radical anti-Israel group at MIT called the CAA. In recent weeks, the CAA's anti-Semitic rhetoric has shifted the culture on campus to such an extreme of intolerance that 70% of MIT's Jewish students polled feel forced to hide their identities and perspectives. An Israeli student whose identity and personal info was sold online for a bounty has not left his dorm room in weeks out of fear due to death threats. For my part, I was forced to leave my study group for my doctoral exams halfway through the semester because my group members told me that the people at the Nova Music Festival deserved to die because they were partying on stolen land. After a postdoc at MIT said that Jewish Israelis want to enslave the world in a global apartheid system, he falsely claimed that Israel harvests Palestinian organs and implied that the, quote, average Israeli is a Nazi. The DEI officer of his department replied by telling us that nothing he said was hate speech and that the organ harvesting conspiracy theory was, quote, confirmed. Day after day, the MIT administration has failed to enforce its own rules on anti-Semitic actors, such as the interfaith chaplain intimidating Jewish students, DEI staff publicly declaring that Israel has no right to exist, faculty dismissing student concerns for their safety by telling them that if they are scared, they should just go back to Israel. CAA protesters blocking the hallways, storming the offices of the MIT Israel internship offices and harassing the staff and faculty there, and inviting dangerous outsiders to campus to join them in yelling hateful and violent chants. This is the same climate of anti-Semitism that has led to massacres of Jews throughout the centuries. This is not just harassment. This is our lives on the line. The MIT administration has punted disciplinary processes to a faculty committee on discipline, which has thus far not received a single one of our complaints. MIT admin has even failed to staff a new task force against hate, which will dually combat anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. This atmosphere is intolerable. Jewish students do not believe that the MIT administration has done an adequate job to make students feel safe on campus. President Kornbluth, please let me go back to being a scientist. Let me go back to being a student. I don't want to have to keep advocating for Jewish student safety on campus. It's not my job. It's your job. Please do your job and act now. And if you can't, I'm asking Congress to do it for you. Thank you.
When I heard this, I immediately knew that this was someone whose perspective I very much wanted to center and hear more from. She's an incredible person, somebody who has taken really a leadership position in a Ivy League school, president of the Israel Advocacy Group. And what obviously I found so fascinating was this mention of coming from a family where her father is Muslim and her mother is Jewish, how that plays a role in shaping her views towards Israel. It's obviously an incredibly important perspective in many ways because it upends the typical boxes that Jewish voices and Jewish perspectives are placed in, particularly on college campus. This is obviously someone who does not fit neatly into any box, which is why I consider it such a privilege to be able to speak today for our conversation with Talia Khan. I wanted to talk and begin with a question about anti-Semitism on campus, but I wanted to start with what was your feelings on anti-Semitism on campus and your experience up till October 7th? But not including, meaning prior. On October 6th, if I would have come to you and said, Talia, what does it feel like being Jewish on campus? What do you think your answer would have been?
I think I would say that I felt supported by the Jewish community, and certainly I didn't generally feel any kind of hostility from the non-Jewish community. Of course, there were always people who didn't like Israel, and this is my 8th year at MIT. I did undergrad here, and now I'm a graduate student.
Wow.
And occasionally you would hear stories of people saying kind of nasty things to Israelis who were in the IDF, but they were one-off. And we knew that we had an anti-Israel club on campus, but they weren't super active. And you were mostly able to ignore those people. And it didn't seem like the vast majority of MIT students or faculty or whatever, it didn't seem like the vast majority of campus aligned with them in any way or had hostility towards Israel or Jews.
How do you understand what changed following October 7th? And I want to give two possibilities, though they're not mutually exclusive. Do you see it as that the average Jew on campus became, either through your own activism and your own kind of affiliation, more intertwined with the state of Israel? Or do you feel like what really changed wasn't the way you're perceived or even the way you feel towards Israel becoming more intertwined? What changed is that there's just an upswelling of the students looking at Jews on campus differently. What do you think changed in your experience? Like, when did you first notice something has changed campus-wide in America following this horrific terrorist attack that took place in Israel?
I think it's a few things. First, in terms of the Jewish community, there were a lot of people who, prior to October 7th, maybe identified as Jewish, didn't feel any particular affinity towards Israel, or even maybe actively disliked Israel. And after October 7th, I had a lot of people coming to me saying, I finally realized why Israel needs to exist. And before, I had no connection towards Israel. And now I'm living in a situation where my romantic partner hates Israel and isn't Jewish. And everybody who's in my living community hates Israel and isn't Jewish. And I feel uncomfortable and unsafe in my living community expressing that I am Jewish and supportive of Israel and understand why Israel deserves the right to exist. So that certainly happened, was that more people became more keenly aware that every single Jew, no matter if you're Jewish or Orthodox, people see you as Jewish, and you would be targeted no matter what by people who hate Jews. And then I think the second thing is, so when I was answering your first question you asked about prior to October 7th, I said it seemed like nobody had these feelings towards Israel or towards Jews. I'm now seeing, we're all seeing, that unfortunately, it's just seemed that way. But under the surface, there was deeply embedded, not only at this institution at MIT, but in the entire world. There was, under the layer of whatever, this anti-Semitism, this anti-Israel sentiment, being anti-Israel. I think that being anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic. Of course, we could get into that another time. It's a big thing. But this sentiment, and that after October 7th, more and more people felt more comfortable exposing those opinions and those viewpoints. And it really exposed at MIT how deeply embedded this anti-Israel, anti-Semitic sentiment is among not only students, among faculty, staff, even chaplains, DEI. And that's been the most shocking and disappointing part, is to see the normalization
of anti-Semitism on campus, and just the morphing of how anti-Semitism has gone, there's always been anti-Semitism throughout our entire existence, our entire history as a Jewish nation, and how it has morphed into, it's just anti-Israel, it's just from the river to the sea, intifada.
It's in the sophisticated wrapping.
Absolutely. And how that is now socially acceptable to be screaming in the hallways and posting on social media. And so I think it's just been shocking to see how it's been morphed into something that's normalized, socially acceptable.
Do you have a clear memory of the first time following October 7th that you were like, wow, something has changed, where you were the witness, you were party to just a type of vitriol that you never had expected? Again, you mentioned you were on MIT for 8 years. You mentioned that you're a scientist. Maybe you could tell us what area you're in. You're not exactly studying the Middle East in MIT, not to say that that would make it any more okay, but when was the first time that you remember post October 7th where you almost had like, wow, like something has clearly changed?
I am a graduate student in mechanical engineering, and I am preparing to take my doctoral exams, my qualifying exams. And in order to prepare for these exams, you join a study group of people who are taking the same subjects as you. I was studying with 2 Arab students, and these people were my good friends, I thought, and we spent a lot of time studying together. And I was thinking, kumbaya, Jewish, Muslim, whatever. One of them was even Palestinian from Qatar. And I thought, like, wow, this is awesome. We're getting along. We're studying. MIT's so international, interdisciplinary, science breaks borders.
All the good stuff.
Yes, that's what I thought. And also, I really thought that these people were my good friends. I felt very close to them. And immediately after October 7th, when I turned on my phone after Chag, I saw that they were posting on social media like Free Palestine flags and, reposting some pretty horrible things about Hamas's resistance and, celebrating this.
Meaning even before the counterattack, even before what's happening in Gaza.
Yes.
This was the immediate reaction.
Nothing had happened.
The immediate reaction was this was justified resistance, that what we saw properly as a horrific terrorist massacre, as a 9/11, so to speak, that took place in Israel, they immediately framed it as resistance.
Yes, absolutely. And I was shocked, to say the least, especially because, as you just mentioned, at that point, there had been no counteroffensive. Only people who had been killed were people on Israeli soil. And of course, as you know, it wasn't even just Jews who were kidnapped, killed, etc. And I reached out to them and said, like, hey.
I was going to ask you reached out directly to them. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because again, like, I'd been spending 10 plus hours a week studying with these people for a while. And I thought that they would be able to have a constructive conversation with me. And I thought, these are reasonable, kind people. Of course, they're going to understand why I find this problematic. And we had a conversation, and I explained, like, of course, I understand that you're scared because, at that point, again, the counteroffensive hadn't happened, but we all knew what was going to happen. And I said, of course, especially for the Palestinian student, that I understood that they were concerned about maybe family or friends or whatever that they had in advance of the ground offensive retaliation, whatever. But I was a little bit shocked at the rhetoric that the way that they were speaking about Israel, the way that they were speaking about Hamas and the attack. And, we tried to have a conversation about it. And it kind of went to a place where, Israeli soldiers also rape women and behead babies and la, 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 just kind of spewing lies and propaganda. And then to the point where the Palestinian student told me that the people at the Nova Music Festival massacre deserved to die because they were partying on stolen land. And when this person who I thought was my friend, I thought cared about me and was going to be able to understand me, as, Jewish mother, Muslim father, I tried to be very understanding. I come from a very multicultural upbringing. The fact that she would say something like that, I still can't possibly begin to understand how people justify killing of innocent civilians. And it took me a few days to really accept that that is how this person feels. And that is how a lot of people feel. they really believe that there is justification for what Hamas did to these innocent people at a music festival. And of course, after that, the rhetoric across campus, across the world, on social media especially, just got worse and worse. But that, for me, was the moment when I realized something has changed, and there are people who I thought were my friends who are clearly not.
Let me ask you, you mentioned and you gave, it was a little bit more, just under 4 minutes of testimony that you gave to Congress, and we could have multiple hours of conversation unpacking what you said. It was quite powerful. One of the things that you mentioned was your disappointment, not with your friends, but with the faculty at MIT. I'm curious if there were specific incidents in mind where you felt unsupported or even worse, just outright discriminated against on campus. What does that look like for a faculty member to kind of step, in your mind, out of bounds on this issue? Like, were you reaching out for support? Was it an incident you were involved in or somebody else? I'm just curious if you could unpack that a little bit more, what you were referencing.
Sure. I'm the president of the MIT Israel Alliance, which is an organization that we started after October 7th because there was clearly a lot that needed to be dealt with and we needed to organize. And as such, I receive a lot of the stories of anti-Semitism on campus. But I can start by explaining one situation that I was present for. And that was, we were talking to a faculty member, me and some other members of my executive board, and an Israeli student was saying how scared she was being on campus with these calls for intifada. And for example, one Israeli student got doxxed, his video was shared online and his information was sold for a bounty, and then he got death threats, and he was so scared that he left MIT's campus and went to Israel. He felt more safe in a war zone than he did on MIT's campus. So this student was explaining this to this faculty member, and the faculty member told her, if you are so scared, go back to Israel. And there is no situation in which it is acceptable for an institution to be saying, we're not going to do what we are supposed to do to protect you. If you feel scared, just leave. Go back to Israel. And this line of go back to Israel is what we've been hearing in various forms for generations. Get out of Germany, get out of Poland.
Go elsewhere.
Go be with your Jewish people. Yeah, we don't want you here. Stop complaining. You guys are the ones causing the problem. So it's shocking that. And then, of course, we've had tons of issues with the DEI infrastructure at MIT, as we've also been seeing across university campuses across the United States. And Jewish students are being told that Jews are not a protected class. And so we can't file certain types of reports. And then we have had direct intimidation and bullying by, for example, an interfaith chaplain at MIT who, during a lecture on Native Americans, interrupted the event 4 times to talk about how Israel is an evil, white supremacist, colonial, apartheid, et cetera, state. And then had all of the students, the Jewish students who are keeping kosher, raise their hands that she could individually give them a kosher dessert. And somebody who is not even Jewish emailed us after that event to report her conduct and said that even as a non-Jew, they felt so uncomfortable because they could see that she was sizing up these Jewish students as she was handing out this kosher food to them to see how they felt about what she had said. And this non-Jewish student said that they felt so uncomfortable, even as a non-Jew, that they can't imagine how the Jewish students felt. And they can imagine how the Jewish students would be comfortable in an event with this interfaith chaplain going forward. And I mean, there's countless examples of other students, faculty, staff, DEI officers, just not behaving in a way that should be socially acceptable, but has somehow become socially acceptable and normalized on campus. I mean, in all of last year, approximately 250 complaints were reported to our IDHR. It's the Discrimination and Harassment Resources Center at MIT. And in just the past month, they've gotten 400 of these reports. reports.
Just the last month.
Just the last month. So it's skyrocketing, these cases all over campus. And I'm certain that I haven't even heard a 10th. And I have heard many, many, many. So it's just pervasive and it's at all levels.
I'm so sorry. It is harrowing to hear about the experiences. I'm wondering, there was this reckoning because of the congressional testimony of the university presidents. You testified that day, which is how I discovered, and I thought your address was pitch perfect and quite powerful. Do you have any thoughts as a student? You're clearly an intelligent student. You're in the MIT mechanical engineering program for, your 8th year on campus. What do you think needs to be done on MIT's campus going forward? What are you looking for? There was a reckoning on some campuses. We saw there was a lot of movement in the leadership on Penn, much less movement that we saw on MIT, on Harvard's campus. Is there something specific policy changes that you think are absolutely necessary to see going forward?
Sure. There are some things that we have asked for, such as required Holocaust training for faculty, staff, and certainly these DEI officers need that. But I think the problem we're seeing is that I think a lot of people are saying, oh, if we get rid of the university president, everything will be fine. It's the presidents who did poorly at the congressional hearing. If we get rid of them, it'll be fine. I think everybody I know on campus understands that it is much deeper than that. It is embedded in the infrastructure at MIT. And I'll give you another example. I put up Israeli flags and a banner that says, "We stand with Israel," and a banner that says, "No excuse for terror." I put these up in my windows in my office on campus that face Massachusetts Avenue.
In your personal office?
Yes. And again, I've been on campus for a long time. Putting flags and posters up is a very MIT thing to do. It's a very quirky campus. And certainly, there's lots of Ukrainian flags up, Black Lives Matter flags up, LGBTQ flags up. And that's something that's part of the quirkiness of MIT, is people kind of
sharing their identity, their causes, etc.
Yeah, exactly. So I put these things up, and 6 days after I put these up, MIT changed their policy on postering for the first time since 2007 to ban flags and large banners. And they, through a series of not even contacting me directly, but sending messengers to intimidate me into taking them down, finally forced me to take them down. And still, if you walk throughout campus, you're going to see Ukrainian flags. You're going to see a Black Lives Matter banner.
You'll see the LGBTQ flag, for sure.
Exactly. So they created a rule, essentially, to silence a pro-Israel voice. And insanely, an MIT alum from 20 years ago reached out to me and said the same thing happened to me. And he shared some articles from the Tech, which is the MIT school newspaper, talking about exactly what happened to him.
From 20 years ago.
20 years ago, he put an Israeli flag on his window in his dorm at MIT, his graduate dorm. And MIT began to make up rules against flags, even though there were flags all over campus. And they said, oh, it's a fire hazard. Oh, it's going to damage the building's infrastructure. This little flag.
And it was covered in the MIT newspaper.
Yes, it was 20 years ago. And they threatened to kick him out of the dorm if he didn't take it down. So clearly there is a problem that is at least 20 years old on MIT's campus of trying to silence pro-Israel voices. And I could never begin to understand where these tendencies, where this comes from.
I have a guess.
I mean, yeah, sure, but it's just mind-boggling to me that they think that they can get away with this stuff, and honestly that they have. But to go back to the root of your original question, I think that a lot of institutional change needs to happen. I think that MIT is the only institution of the three that testified in Congress that didn't issue any sort of even half-baked apology for the now infamous genocide question. It's calling for the genocide of Jews harassment. MIT is the only one that didn't issue any kind of apology. And indeed, the MIT Corporation Executive Board sent a letter in support of President Kornblum's testimony, saying that she's doing an excellent job combating anti-Semitism on campus. Again, continuing to just gaslight us. We had a similar letter from a lot of senior faculty at MIT. We're just being gaslighted continuously. And really, these people all need to go. And we need a new group of people in place who will aid Holocaust training. Apparently, we need that. And really transparency in disciplinary processes is another thing. The whole disciplinary process has been incredibly opaque. In President Kornbluth's testimony, she spoke about the Faculty Committee on Discipline and that these cases are being referred to this committee. When last week I spoke to a professor on the Faculty Committee on Discipline who said that he hasn't received a single case yet. And when he asked if he should be expecting more, he was told that, some other group is dealing with it. So the Faculty Committee on Discipline doesn't know what's happening. We don't know what's happening. It's very opaque and people are still getting harassed. My friend got harassed in the elevator the other day. Someone said that there should just be a one state solution and obviously not a Jewish state.
It's so incredibly disappointing to hear this. I'm wondering, in your mind, a lot of people are faced with this question of, is now the time where Jews say, we've had enough of the Ivy Leagues and we're going to go elsewhere. We're going to find other institutions where we can really feel more agency and that we're seen more? Or is now the time to almost double down and say, we're not going anywhere. This is a problem that we need to solve together. And I'm curious for you how you think of that question about the relationship of the Jewish community to higher education in general. Do you feel like even more of a will to stay? And I'm wondering if as a part of your answer, you can reflect a little bit about how this experience has changed, if at all, to your own personal Jewish identity and affiliation.
Oh, first of all, of course, there's a lot of different opinions, 2 Jews, 50 opinions.
Yeah.
And even in our own organization, lots of different thoughts and ideas for approaches to these many problems on campus. I personally think that this is the time that we need to double down. MIT, Harvard, these institutions are creating, supposedly, ideally, the next generation of leaders in science, technology, etc. And we can't just say, they're not supporting us, we'll leave, because then what are we going to do? These institutions are just going to produce a bunch of anti-Semites who've never met a Jew. That's unacceptable. And that's just going to make everything worse for us. So I believe firmly that this is the time to double down and get these institutions to change. I clearly feel incredibly strong about that. I've been putting this effort ahead of everything in my life, ahead of my studies, which, is unfortunate. I would love to just get back to studying.
Every time I contacted you, I felt guilty. I'm like, you're probably so busy. It's end of the semester. We've been back and forth for a couple of weeks. I'm persistent with the right guest. I needed to hear from you. I need to connect. You've been very patient with me. I hope I haven't overstepped. But yeah, I could imagine. No. You said, I want to go back to being a scientist. That's what you said.
Yes.
I appreciate that.
I do. That's all we want. I didn't come to MIT to be some sort of political activist. I came here to do science. But I feel incredibly compelled as a Jewish person that as somebody who I feel that I have the capability to help amplify the voice of Jewish students and even, again, faculty at MIT, because it's not just students who are being harassed, it's faculty as well and staff as well. I feel that it is my responsibility to make this community safe for Jewish people. And we know that these problems are only going to get worse. We've seen the recent polling that says, 18 to 25-year-olds are
terrifying.
Yeah.
This terrifies me. The support for Israel craters among the younger generation.
Support Hamas, believe that what Hamas did on October 7th was an acceptable act of resistance. It's just astounding. So we know this problem's only going to get worse. So if we don't create change on these campuses now and set the precedent for how campuses need to behave and how they need to protect Jewish people, I don't want to think about what's going to happen in 5-10 years. I mean, we've seen it in the past 2,000 years. We've seen it.
I'm sure you have a fascinating Jewish journey of your own. One thing you mentioned in your congressional testimony, which I assume you drafted beforehand, it was incredibly eloquent, and you chose to mention, it was a choice, and I think it was an important and the right choice, where you mentioned that you come from a home where you have a Jewish mother and a Muslim father. That was an important choice to say that to Congress, where you kind of see you're not somebody who has never been exposed, you're growing up to somebody outside, so to speak, of what we normally call the bounds of quote unquote our community. I'm curious, in your own Jewish journey and your own identity, how has that factored in? I can only imagine, your relationship to a father who's Muslim. That's a really important and fascinating relationship to look into. But secondly, your own Jewish identity post October 7th, how, if at all, has it changed?
As you just said, my mother is Jewish. My father is from Afghanistan. He's Muslim. All my family pretty much on his side is Muslim. Muslim. I have female cousins who cover their hair. And I guess also I have two half siblings, one of whom, my half sister from my father, has an Indian mother, and my half brother from my father is Christian. And I went to Catholic high school.
Like a UN.
Yeah,
That's
very
impressive.
yeah, very multicultural upbringing for sure. My mother did raise me and my brother Jewish. We went to a Reformed Jewish day school before Catholic high school. And I always identified as Jewish, though of course having the last name Khan, Khan, rather than Kahn, it's not the Jewish spelling. And my middle name is Malalai, which is an Afghan name. So it's obviously very much a part of who I am, eating certain traditional Afghan foods when I was growing up, and, having family friends who are Muslim, people who I called my aunt and uncle, not actually,
Sure.
But very multicultural. I always was interested in learning about all of these other religions that I was surrounded by. And the reason that I included that in my speech is because I think right now people are trying to play this like anti-Semitic versus Islamophobic, or like this is about like people attacking Muslims.
To weaponize the harassment and the pain of the Jewish community against the Islamic, like one always has to come at the expense of the other.
Sure. And that's exactly what I was trying to explain is couldn't possibly happen with me. I'm the president of the MIT Israel Alliance. I love Israel. I stand for Israel. I stand with Israel, and I will continue to support Israel as much as I can. And my saying that and my saying that I'm Jewish does not mean anything about how I feel about Muslims or my whole Muslim family. And I think that people like to put people in boxes and assume like, oh, this Jewish girl's probably never met a Muslim. They don't understand how scary it must be to be a hijabi woman walking down the street right now. But I do. I'm obviously not a hijabi Muslim, but again, I have family members who are. And I think that it's important for people to know that while I feel very strongly about Israel, I understand that there are many people feeling scared right now. And it shouldn't be a one or the other. Calling for the safety of Jews on campus doesn't say that we don't also want the safety of other groups on campus. Every single student on a campus should feel safe, period. Jews, Muslims, African Americans, Asians, whatever. Insert any group here. Calling for the genocide of any group is wrong on campus, period. End of story. And I guess I just wanted to highlight that because people like to put people into boxes, and I very much do not fit into a box. And I want to increase dialogue as much as possible. I think that's why I did it. And then I guess to the other part of your question about if this has changed my view of Judaism in any way, I think that my Judaism is what is propelling me to be so strong and forceful in this fight and to put this above everything else, because I know that it's not about me. It's not about Talia being safe on campus. It's about my whole community here being safe on campus. It's about the next generation of Jewish students being safe on campus, because even the people who I don't know who are going to come to MIT, they're still my Jewish family. And it's not about me. It's about all of us. And I think in these days, every Jew has felt more of a sense of community than ever before. I think I certainly have. I think everybody's been able to connect on a much deeper level than before. And in a lot of ways, I think that's really awesome and beautiful that we've all been able to connect more and feel much closer as a Jewish family internationally. So yeah, I guess that's how my Judaism has kind of shaped what I'm doing right now.
Talia, your voice, your efforts, your story are so incredible, so moving, and so valuable. Exactly as you said, I'm sure they're valuable for Talia and your immediate friends, but they're even more valuable really for how they articulate, I think, what our collective community is going through. And your efforts and advocacy and thoughtfulness and sensitivity are something that really, really inspires me. And I am so incredibly grateful for your time speaking today.
Thank you so much for having me and letting me blather for so long.
You were absolutely wonderful. I cannot thank you enough. I do hope that we have the opportunity to hear more from Talia. I found her perspective, especially how she negotiates her contemporary views and how they've shaped her, given her familial background. And she's a voice that I think is so important, specifically in this moment right now. On 1840 on our website, we recently published an article by our friend Michael Avi Helfand entitled "When Calls for Jewish Jewish genocide can cost a university its government funding, where he really gets into the weeds, so to speak, about how free speech should be governed on campus. And it's really not as simple as a lot of people, including myself, would think. Avi, I always call him the educator-in-chief of all legal issues. He writes in a way that really lays out the legal issues, so you really understand that you're not just speaking from your emotion, because as I have found, certainly with myself, our community, the Jewish community, is just as capable as speaking with emotion, obviously, on such an important issue as others, and it's not always clear what exactly we should be advocating for. He lays out some of the difficulty based on the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which has a provision that prohibits institutions receiving federal funding, including indirect funding, from discriminating on the basis of race, color, or national origin. And what Avi points out is that, importantly, the anti-discrimination rules prohibit more than just direct discrimination. They also prohibit schools from acting with deliberate indifference to severe, pervasive, and objective offensive harassment, including peer-to-peer harassment. Again, you can go on the 1840 website if you really want to see and understand how he breaks this down as a lawyer, because nobody does it like Avi Helfand. But he does point out the difficulty over here. Applying these rules, he writes, to anti-Semitic harassment, however, presents a bit of a puzzle. Jew hatred does not, at first glance, fall under the three categories of discrimination prohibited by universities under this 1964 Civil Rights Act: race, color, or national origin. It would more naturally fall under religious discrimination, which Congress expressly omitted from the kinds of discrimination prohibited under this title. So it is quite tricky, and you can read what he says in this article. One voice I have always found to be absolutely illuminating on these issues is the voice of Professor Steven Pinker. Steven Pinker is somebody who I've long sought to have on the podcast, an incredible voice, really not just on campus. This is something he's only recently been vocal about. Steven Pinker is a world-renowned cognitive psychologist. He is a philosopher, specifically in the philosophy of language. He also has done incredible work. If you haven't seen his book already, he's written a few books, but he has a famous book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, which talks about how violence in human society has declined over time. That is an absolute classic. I was introduced to him from the book The Language Instinct, which I borrowed from Yoni Statman, and it actually belonged to his older brother, David Statman. I am not sure if I ever return that book. I am extraordinarily lucky that he was willing to come on. He has 1,000 podcast requests, and really a lot of the credit is owed to our longtime listeners and our chief grammarian. Grammarian, is that how I pronounce it? Well, we'll find out how I should pronounce it, because that person is Mel Barinholtz. Mel and his son Daniel Barinholtz are actually, Mel is Steven Pinker's brother-in-law. Steven Pinker is married to Rebecca Goldstein, that's Mel's late wife's sister, and Daniel Barinholtz is a member of my community and comes to my shiurim. When Mel is in town, he comes too. They're absolutely wonderful. And I called it a favor. I try not to, but sometimes when you know somebody has connections to somebody whose voice you think is that important, sometimes you call in a favor. And they were incredibly gracious in reaching out to Professor Pinker, their brother-in-law / uncle. And he was incredibly gracious, like boom, right away. He said, sure, no problem, let's do it. Somebody who appreciates family, and I just need to say over here, because the real familial connection is to Rebecca Goldstein, that's Professor Pinker's wife, whose books have influenced me for quite some time. She's an incredible writer. She wrote a book on Kurt Gödel. She herself has a fascinating story, fascinating upbringing that is not for today, but hopefully one day we'll be able to speak directly with her. But I am so grateful that Professor Steven Pinker, who has been a really important voice on what is the way forward for Jews on college campus, how should campuses be thinking about free speech. You're not always going to agree with his answers, but I think he is playing a long-term game and really understanding the consequences of limiting speech, or on the flip side, just letting anything goes. He wrote an article, if you want to read just a basic distillation of his approach. In mid-December, he wrote for the Boston Globe what he calls a 5-point plan to save Harvard from itself. And in this article, he discusses what he believes is necessary in order to reinstill some measure of trust in the university community with how they deal and approach speech. And the 5-point plan, I'll go through it quickly. We discuss it more in depth. Number 1 is free speech. He does believe that there needs to be free speech on campus. What he calls they should adopt a clear and conspicuous policy on academic freedom. His next, which is something we have lost over the last couple decades, and not everyone will agree that universities should be taking this stance. I do appreciate where he's coming from, and that is institutional neutrality, where he writes, a university does not need a foreign policy, and it does not need to issue pronouncements on the controversies and events of the day. I actually hear two sides to this. Maybe the exact point of a university. I'm sure in many universities, particularly in Yeshiva University, there is a sense of being a values-driven education, but sometimes that can be very upsetting, especially what we are seeing now in higher education, where so many of the values in the Ivy League schools are so dissonant to what we think is basic truth and decency. But his second point is institutional neutrality. His third point is nonviolence, which isn't just talking about punching or fighting or kicking. He talks, some students think it is a legitimate form of political expression to drown out a speaker, block the audience's view with a screen, obstruct public passageways, invade a lecture hall chanting slogans over bullhorns, force administrators out of their office and occupy the building or get in the face of other students. Universities, he writes, should not indulge acts of vandalism, trespassing, and extortion. Free speech does not include a heckler's veto, which blocks the speech of others. That's certainly something that we've been seeing too much of. His fourth point is viewpoint diversity, making sure that there are people from a diverse points of views in universities and not just parroting all the same partisan points. And his final point, it's wild how quickly this has become a mainstream call, but he does write disempowering DEI. This is what he writes in the Boston Globe. Many of the assaults on academic freedom, not to mention common sense, come from a burgeoning bureaucracy that calls itself diversity, equity, and inclusion while enforcing a uniformity of opinion, a hierarchy of victim groups, and the exclusion of free thinkers. He feels that this needs to be dismantled, expose their policies to the light of day, and repeal the ones that cannot be publicly justified. Steven Pinker is an absolute leader on this issue, and again, all of our guests on this episode who are really at the front lines of this issue. There are so many other issues I would rather be talking to them about, but this is the issue of the day, and it's really important that we're able to speak with them and ask what's next. And here is our conversation with Professor Steven Pinker. I want to ask you the following question. If I would have come to you and asked you on October 6th, the day before the terrorist massacre on October 7th that has really upended a lot of the ways we're thinking about anti-Semitism in the United States, if I would have asked you on October 6th, what is the state of college campuses' treatment of anti-Semitism, how would you have approached that issue? Would you have said, oh, it's going fine, it's going great, there's not much of an issue? Or do you think that there was a larger issue that existed before what we're seeing now in reaction to October 7th?
Well, I knew that in big sectors of universities, there is a kind of hatred of Western civilization, not throughout the university, but in some sectors. And that could include the Jewish community and Jewish students who've, of course, prospered in the West. I would not have predicted that the sympathy for, in particular, Palestinian terrorist groups would be as high as it was. The letter from the 34 student groups at Harvard did come as an unpleasant surprise.
You were surprised by that. So you have stepped forward in the aftermath of October 7th to talk about how universities should be treating speech on campus. There's been given a great deal of attention for balancing the values of free speech with the larger issues of how do we make sure students feel safe. And you published in the Boston Globe. Did you feel compelled to speak out on this as a Jewish person or as somebody who has explored language, explored philosophy, and explored sociology? Before we get into the details of what you shared, what compelled you to weigh in on this?
I would say it's not in particular as a Jewish faculty member. It is from my commitment to the whole point of scholarship, of science, of universities, of higher education, namely that we are in pursuit of the truth. It's actually emblazoned on the crest of my employer, Harvard University, Veritas. And in many ways, universities have departed from this noble ideal by criminalizing certain opinions, by allowing for forceful disruptions by protest groups as opposed to reasoned argument, by a narrowing of the range of opinion that is explored on campuses, by a bureaucracy that has increasingly infringed on the rights of students and faculty to explore ideas. So these are long-standing concerns. They're salient to me for two reasons. One of them is I am in a field that tends to explore some controversial issues, nature and nurture, differences between men and women, whether humans have violent, aggressive impulses.
Sure.
All of these are issues. And if you've got people saying, oh, you can't think that thought, you're just never going to understand what makes humans tick. Humans are a complex species. We've got some ugly sides, and it's better that we understand them. So I say, and if you've got a regime that says, let's only talk about theories of humans that make us look nice or that make us into blank slates so that we can program people into whatever kind of creatures we want, I'm going to say that's really getting in the way of what I do, which is to try to figure out what kind of animals we are.
Exactly.
And the other reason is, as a cognitive psychologist, as someone who studies how people reason, and in particular who deals in my last book, Rationality, with the paradox that our species has managed to do some amazing things. We've explored other planets, we discovered DNA, we've invented vaccines, we've doubled our lifespan. But if you look at any given human being, we're filled with these biases and irrationalities, and we're vulnerable to conspiracy theories and fake news and quack cures and mystical woo-woo. How did one species manage to be so irrational and so rational? And the answer is we form communities that explore, that seek the truth, that are designed to circumvent our biases. Namely, one person proposes an idea. It might be right, might be wrong, probably wrong, because most new ideas are wrong, but everyone else gets to say what's wrong with it. And that's how we advance. We have peer review, we have fact-checking, we have editing, we have rabbinical commentary, and you can't just say something and impose it by force. You've got to argue for it. If you disable that process by saying some ideas you can't say, we have an official doctrine of what's true or what's false, then you have short-circuited the search for truth based on what we know about the human mind.
You've done some incredible work in wide-ranging fields that really bear upon the moment that we're in now. And I'm curious, you have been a faculty member in the upper echelons of academia for many, many years. You've seen many crises. I'm sure you were teaching during September 11th. You were teaching during the Ukraine and Russian war. And now you're looking out and you are seeing the conflict between Palestine and Israel are animating students in a way. We're both Jewish, but to an outside observer, it does strike me as somewhat strange that this has become a cause that has captured the passions of the contemporary students in universities throughout the country. How do you understand why this issue has become so divisive and why you see people marching outside the Jewish community and outside the Palestinian community? It is galvanizing so much more than the actual people affiliated with these countries or these populations. What do you make of the reason why Israel and Palestine captures the attention specifically of contemporary college students?
It's a good question. It's not a completely new thing, because when I was an undergraduate back in the 1970s at McGill University in Montreal, our student paper was obsessed with Israel. It was highly anti-Zionist, anti-Israel. It was almost a campus joke. As I think, a spillover from the 1960s radicalism that kind of pits the oppressors, namely Western civilization, against victim groups. Now, that has gotten much worse, but the seeds were sown back then, and it is, to a large extent, the campus radicals of the 60s and 70s who then grew up and became deans and presidents. I don't think they explicitly carried over the 60s hard left radical ideology with them, but there's still a bit of a sympathy. Like if students are occupying a building, well, that kind of reminds me of my youth when we occupied buildings. And so there's, rather than a serious principled analysis of what is a legitimate protest, what crosses the line into criminality, what is a legitimate criticism of, say, Israeli policy, and what is a division of the world into oppressors and victims. I think there's a lot of soft thinking on the part of many of our university leaders. Going back to your question, it is a mystery why, especially as someone who looks at numbers, how serious are different wars in terms of the number of people who are killed. As horrible as the wars in Israel, Palestine, Egypt are, by the accounts of world history, they're pretty small wars. Even in recent memory, the Syrian civil war has killed at least 10 times, maybe 20 times as many people as will be killed in Israel versus Gaza. So why didn't you have student protests demanding an immediate ceasefire in the Syrian civil war? The war, which almost no one has heard of in Ethiopia last year between the Tigray rebels and the Ethiopian government, has killed far more people than in Israel and Palestine. Why weren't there protesters for a ceasefire then? It is a legitimate question. Some of it may tie into traditional anti-Semitism.
I'm kind of asking that, meaning I look at you as somebody who really calls it by the numbers. So that's why this question fascinates me so much for you. Like, obviously, you are Jewish and whatever affiliation you have to Israel, maybe we could ask about later. But do you see kind of that old hatred, anti-Semitism animating some of this, or do you think it's something else or a combination?
It's got to be some of it. It's certainly not continuous with the kind of genteel WASP country club anti-Semitism that kept Jews out of Harvard for much of the 20th century. It's quite different. It's coming from the left rather than the moderate right or the extreme right. We did see some of it with the birth of radical leftist politics in the 1960s and 1970s. So it has blown up from the kernel that existed back then. And it's hard to deny that it has something to do with anti-Semitic impulses. You've got a highly visible, highly successful minority where it's kind of a natural human tendency to envy and resent success, to blame it on nefarious greed and conspiracies rather than intrinsic features of the culture, like emphasis on education, entrepreneurial spirit, cosmopolitanism. But those are not intuitive. It's naturally just to assume if someone has more, they must have stolen it. So it does engage a primitive part of our prejudice that throughout many centuries has manifested itself against Jews. And in other countries, other successful, sometimes entrepreneurial middlemen minorities, like the Indians in Uganda in the 1970s, the Chinese in Vietnam and Philippines and Fiji, ethnic minorities that are successful, that occupy middleman niches, are frequent targets of vicious ethnic hatred. And Israel as a country, it doesn't have a lot of resources. How did it get so rich? And militarily successful, it's a natural human tendency to say this must be something nefarious there. You plug that into the growing narrative that the world is divided between oppressors and victims, something that doesn't begin in universities. A lot of our elite private high schools have it, sometimes elementary schools, in part because the hard left radical ideology found its way into many institutions because that is part of the playbook for how the radical left chooses to transform societies. It's no longer get the proletariat to seize power from the bourgeoisie. It's become presidents of school boards and deans of colleges and bureaucrats in the diversity, equity, and inclusion enterprise, go into high schools, take over curricula, take over journals. And so there is a strategy of transforming society by taking over institutions from inside. And that has had a cumulative effect as well.
Your article weighed in on what you hope to see the future of how we treat speech in universities. I'm wondering if you could give some advice to those who want to make the case for Israel on campus, or even to understand what comes next in the aftermath of so much of the divisiveness that has arose on campus. Oftentimes, extreme left ideologies produce just extreme right ideologies, and then you get caught in this wave and mess of shouting and information and this partisanship. What steps do you think need to be taken to restore a middle on university campuses, to make that moderate way of thinking, for that to re-emerge?
Yeah, and you're right to note that there is also, of course, a virulent stream of anti-Semitism from the right, from the "we will not be replaced" slogan chanters. And I get email from the right saying, how come Jews are only 2% of the population, but X% of the faculty at Harvard, or X% of the owners of major media? So those traditional tropes certainly are popular on the right as well. So I think that the background has to be a rededication to the ideals of the pursuit of disinterested truth. So knowing facts, spreading facts, viewpoint diversity, so that you don't get entire programs taken over by a particular ideology, which in practice on university campuses becomes a intersectional critical theory, social justice warfare ideology, often taking over entire departments with no one to give them a sanity check of, hey, maybe let's actually look at some history here and let's consider all sides to a controversy. Certainly free speech so that people who dissent from orthodoxies are not censored or punished. Nonviolence, that is, no matter what you believe, you can hold up your signs, but you can't take over a university building. You can't get in the faces of other students. You can't drown out speakers. Can't take over campus spaces and redecorate them as propaganda billboards. That is, the university has to take ownership of its own spaces for the protection of all students. What this does resist is an attempt to just add Jews to the list of victim groups. So we got to give priority to gay people and African Americans and transgender people, and Jews.
That's not what you're advocating
That's
for.
not
Exactly.
what I'm asking. As soon as you do that, and the next day it's going to be yes, and Muslims. If you criminalize anti-Semitic speech, then it's going to be criminalizing Islamophobic speech, where Islamophobic speech can be pointing out certain truths about radical Muslim movements, for example. So they've got to be content neutral. This means putting up with a certain amount of, frankly, hateful rhetoric. The First Amendment protects hate speech, and I think universities have to as well, as long as they don't cross over into intimidation or incitement of imminent violence or direct threats. But assuming that the facts are on our side, the truth is on our side, the argument's on our side, we shouldn't be afraid of a marketplace of ideas in which we can state the facts about the history of Zionism, the history of Israel, and come down like a ton of bricks on the canard, for example, that Israel is a colonial settler state, which is nonsense. It was not a colony of Portugal or Spain or Britain. The people who came there were not seeking to acquire more land for an empire. They were obviously fleeing persecution. Jews are the indigenous to the area called Israel, and so on. Just those, the UN had a partition plan, which the Arab states rejected, that there was a proposal for a Palestinian state at various times that the Palestinian factions rejected. So those facts, which many of our students are completely ignorant of, ought to be out there. And I think we have to have the conviction that if we do have a case, if we are morally justified in our beliefs, we can state the case, and in a true, fair marketplace of ideas, then these will have a chance. That it's the repression of debate, the repression of speech that has allowed these good versus evil, oppressor versus victim ideologies, which can turn into anti-Semitism, to dominate big chunks of campuses.
One question I have based on your suggestions, which I think were remarkable and did resonate a great deal with me, who gets to determine what is considered violent or non-violent? And this came up with regard to chants for intifada, globalize the intifada. According to your structure, whose job would it be to figure out whether calls for intifada on campus qualify, again, according to your own metrics or your own guide in this, whose job would it be to determine whether or not that does in fact fall within the lines of non-violence?
Well, something like that would not directed at an individual, not calling for imminent violence, would pass, would go through. And as despicable as they are, and I think they are, but we should point out what's despicable about them. The problem is that if you say even calls for political violence in the abstract should be censored or punished, well, what do you do about someone who says that the invasion of Gaza is morally justified? We know it will result in the death of more than 10,000 Palestinian Gazan civilians, but it's justified anyway. Again, this is independent of the merits of that position.
Correct.
But I wouldn't want someone who made that argument to be censored or punished, even though it is a call for violence. Now, maybe, some violence is morally justifiable if it results in less net violence over the long term, but you can't have a coherent policy that says no one may ever advocate political violence, because then it would rule out a lot of Israeli factions who do call, let's be frank, calling for the invasion of Gaza to remove Hamas, knowing that it will result in more than 10,000 civilian deaths, is a call for violence. It may be justified, but you can't say that no one's ever allowed to make such an argument without it shutting down everyone. So in terms of when it crosses the line, well, if the campus already has offices for the punishment of intimidation and bullying, that is, if it's directed at an individual student, if it's a crime, such as vandalism, such as physical intimidation, such as threats of violence, such as actual violence, then it would be just like any other act of vandalism or violence on campus. The campus police should deal with it. And I think, by the way, universities, including Harvard, have been remiss in indulging students who clearly crossed the line from holding up a sign to taking over campus buildings or intimidating Jewish students.
I think you were unique, and I actually appreciated it a great deal that you were one of the people who actually said in the congressional hearings the answer that they gave, what prompted so much outrage of whether or not calling for Jewish genocide qualifies as harassment. By the numbers, you said they actually answered correctly. However, a lot of the hurt or a lot of the pain and the outrage was the fact that there was so much distance between the way they answered that question and the way they've been dealing with all other forms of speech that have been deemed harassment and bullying. Is that correct, that you feel just playing it by the books? Because what you are thinking about is not necessarily the answer to this question, but what happens when we weaponize speech on both sides? Our own speech can eventually be weaponized as well.
That's exactly right. And so Claudine Gay, there's much to criticize in her congressional testimony, including just the whole emotional tone that she ought to have expressed. But she was literally correct that there is no rule on the Harvard books that say you can't say globalize the Intifada, just as there's no law in the United States Criminal Code because we've got the First Amendment. There's no law in any state that says you may not say from the river to the sea. And likewise at Harvard, there's no rule against saying that. And there shouldn't be, because if there is, it could also be used to punish someone who says we should invade Gaza, remove Hamas, regardless of the cost. So she was literally correct. She didn't have a leg to stand on, though, because Harvard had this sorry history punishing all kinds of speech far more innocuous than from the river to the sea. And so you can't suddenly become a First Amendment absolutist when it comes to genocide against the Jews and say, you're allowed to say that, but if you say there are two sexes, then we can make your life a living hell. That's the problem that Harvard found itself in because of its own sorry history of not upholding free speech. You can't uphold it selectively and suddenly say, I disagree with what you say, but I defend to the death your right to say it, the quote attributed to Voltaire. You can't suddenly pull that out of the air when it comes to genocide against Jews and say, yes, but saying that there are two sexes is punishable.
And I noticed that and really did appreciate that you referred to October 7th in your Boston Globe article as a pogrom. But I'm curious for you, if you have any sense of connection, if you've ever visited Israel. I don't know if you've written about it. I tried to read a lot of your books. I'm just curious on a personal level. A friend of mine happens to be your brother-in-law and nephew, really special. He calls in all the time. I'll give him a shout out, Mel Berenholtz, if that's okay. He's a common fixture on 1840 and he is beloved, and his son Dan. But I'm curious on a personal level for you. Did you grow up in a home that had any connection to Israel, or do you personally have any memories or sense of affiliation with Israel?
Oh, yeah. I grew up as a Reform Jew, where probably the biggest commitment to Judaism was Zionism. And this ranged from, on Tu B'Shvat, paying quarters to stick little leaves on diagrams of trees to buy trees to plant in Israel. I went to a Zionist camp. We pretended to be Chalutzim. We sang the Palmach battle song. My father was active in the Canadian Zionist organization. I've been to Israel many times. I'm going back in May. I'm going to speak to the Academy of Humanities and Sciences there, giving a lecture. So yeah, I've been there a number of times. Honestly, I wouldn't say I'm a Zionist, but I'm an anti-Zionist. I think that a lot of the laws and international standards that we apply to all the other 192 countries in the United Nations should apply to Israel as well, namely that its existence should not be up for debate. I think there's much to criticize in the current government of Israel, not least leaving its own citizens vulnerable to murder, kidnapping, and rape. Where was the IDF in defending Israeli soil? I do think that Israel has the rights that other states have. It should not be governed by halakha. All citizens, I think, should have equal rights. I think it needs a more coherent policy of what's going to become of the West Bank. There's much about the Netanyahu government that I detest, but still, the question, should Israel exist, is just should not be a live question. It's been around for
far too long.
Other countries have a much more tenuous claim to a coherent existence, and also just knowing about the various crimes and migrations in human history. Palestinians should live in better circumstances, have more rights, but there are an awful lot of displaced peoples who have not nursed a 75-year resentment. It's just a fact that in the late 1940s, lots of people were moved around the global chessboard. Millions of ethnic Germans were forcibly uprooted from Eastern Europe, many of them murdered in Cyprus, in the partition of India, in Greece and Turkey. People moved around a lot in the 1940s. 1920s, and they got over it, and they became citizens of a country, and they forgot about dreams of returning to where their grandparents lived several generations ago. So I think that's the idea that Israel bears some particular moral stain for doing what the whole world did in the late 1940s is a real moral pathology. Not to deny that the Palestinians have been treated badly, not least by other Arab governments, but including by the Israeli government.
I am so grateful for your time and wisdom. I've been following and reading your books for many, many years, and I'm really grateful for your time. I always close my interviews with more rapid fire questions. Now is a time, and you've written about this a great deal, but I'm curious about what are the books that helped inform that you would recommend to a popular audience for people who are trying to find a way for how to approach political issues in a more thoughtful way. They're trying to clear through a lot of the typical biases that people have. What are the books that influence you that you would recommend to a wider audience?
Well, the book by John Haidt and Greg Lukianoff called The Coddling of the American Mind, and then a follow-up book by Greg Lukianoff called The Canceling of the American Mind, just came out a few months ago, are both good guides to, I think, some of the present crises we find ourselves in. A book by Jonathan Rauch called The Constitution of Knowledge on how did we get to a point where there is so much fake news, conspiracy thinking, which he points out are kind of the default through much of human history. We should flip the question of how did we ever manage to arrive at objective, scientific, disinterested truth? That's the hard part, but it flips that question. Let's see, I find a couple of fairly new online magazines invariably stimulating. Persuasion, founded and edited by Yasha Monk, a political scientist at Johns Hopkins, and Quillette magazine out of Australia, edited by Claire Lehman and a Canadian, Jonathan Kay. These are sources that I look at pretty regularly. There are a lot of good Substacks. Jonathan Haidt has
former guest of 1840.
Yes, okay.
My next question, I always ask people, if somebody gave you an unlimited amount of money and allowed you to take a sabbatical for as long as you need to go back to university and get a second PhD in a different field, you've already carved out quite a broad set of academic disciplines that you have weighed in on. But let's say you were to approach a totally new field. What do you think the subject and title of that dissertation would be?
It might be in computer science, including artificial intelligence. It's a field that I track because it's so closely related to cognitive psychology, my own field. That is, we've got an intelligent system, the human brain. We can develop our own intelligent systems. What do they have in common? How do they differ? How might they differ? What is computable in principle? The questions that are associated with Alan Turing.
Sure.
Going deeper into that, I would find deeply interesting. Constitutional law, that is, what are the principles by which governments are constituted with the consent of the governed?
Those are two great ones. My final questions, I'm always curious about people's sleep schedules, especially storied academics like yourself. What time do you go to sleep at night and what time do you wake up in the morning?
Usually about approximately 1:30 to 8:30.
Oh, okay. That's very doable. Professor Steven Pinker, I am so grateful for your time today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, David. It's an honor.
There is something that resonates with me deeply when Talia Khan, in conversation and in her congressional hearing, said, I just want to be a scientist. In some ways, I feel the same way. I would rather speak to any of these three people about 100 other topics because their work, their background, their life story is that fascinating. And there was so much more to discuss, but I am so incredibly grateful, and it really is a privilege to speak to the absolute leading voices, people who through their own experience, their own leadership, are really at the front lines of asking and answering this question, what is next for higher education in the aftermath of October 7th? And I am so grateful to Rabbi David Wolpe, to Talia Khan, and to Professor Steven Pinker for joining us today. They chart a path. They're not always in agreement, and our listeners may not always agree with them, but these are people who I believe have the vantage point to really understand what are the policies, procedures, and institutional approaches that are necessary to reimagine higher education, to refocus higher education on what it should have been focused on all along, which is providing a place for the development and sharing of great ideas for the next generation of society. So thank you so much for listening. This episode, like so many of our episodes, was edited by our dearest friend, Dina Emerson. If you enjoyed this episode or any of our episodes, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends about it. You can also donate at 1840.org/donate. donate. It really helps us reach new listeners and continue putting out great content. You can also leave us a voicemail with feedback or questions that we may play on a future episode. That number is 516-519-3308. Again, that's 516-519-3308, and we have that episode planned, God willing, for a few weeks from now. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or some of the other great ones we've covered in the past, be sure to check out 1840.org. That's the number 18, followed by the word 40, FORTY.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly emails. Thank you so much for listening, and stay curious, my friends.
Shomer Yisrael Shemor She'eris Yisrael V'yal Yovad Yisrael Omrim Shema Yisrael Shomer Yisrael Shemor She'eris Yisrael V'yal Yovad Yisrael Omrim Shema Yisrael